I grew up in an Eisenhower world. Born in 1952 in a New Jersey suburb, facing the American flag to recite the Pledge of Allegiance each school day morning, I learned that the United States was the best country on earth, with liberty and justice for all. I didn't question why there were no black swimmers in our country club pool. I didn't question why the black lady who cleaned our house each week always called my mother Mrs. Small, but she was always just Etta to us. In 1963, when I was 10 years old, I turned on our black and white TV and saw something that changed my life. I saw black school children, some no older than I, in the streets of Birmingham, Alabama, demanding an end to segregation. I saw them viciously attacked by police dogs and knocked over by the force of water from fire hoses. My illusion of liberty and justice for all died that day, replaced by a determination to make things right. By the time I was a teenager, the interracial optimism and respectability politics of the civil rights era were giving way to black power and black pride. As a white kid, I wasn't sure what I could do. In 1967, at the start of my sophomore year in high school, my best friend was my black classmate, Emmett. At 15, we had neither the vocabulary nor the wisdom to talk productively about race. Listening to his grievances, trying to be sympathetic, I said, "I understand." "You will never understand," Emmett shot back. By the spring of 1968, we were barely speaking. Throughout my childhood, I had found solace in nature. I remember lying under a tree on idle summer days, gazing up at the blue sky through the dappling emerald canopy. Trees were my shelter, my sanctuary, my friends. I sought out whatever ponds and streams and marshes I could find. I signed up for Minnesota Outward Bound to paddle the Boundary Waters Wilderness, where I gathered reindeer moss to make soup, and I heard the cry of the wolf echoing across the lakes at night. When the first Earth Day in 1970 heralded the modern environmental movement, I answered the call. The problem of pollution was palpable, the need for action urgent. I didn't realize at the time that they gave me a convenient excuse to walk away from the challenge of racism. It was, in fact, the quintessence of white privilege to avoid the hard work and the difficult conversations of anti-racism because I could. When I volunteered at the recycling center, nobody called me a racist. Hiding behind what James Baldwin devastatingly disparaged as white innocence, I took the path of least resistance. Fortunately, while I was studying the literature of wilderness in college and training to be an environmental lawyer, people of color in frontline communities were tracing the lethal connections between pollution and racism. In the late 1970s, sociology professor Robert Bullard and his students mapped Houston's waste facilities and discovered that all 5 municipal dumps, 6 of 8 public garbage incinerators, and 3 out of 4 private landfills were sited in black communities, even though African Americans made up only 25% of the population. In 1982, residents of mostly black Warren County, North Carolina, were dragged off to jail after lying down in front of dump trucks brimming with contaminated soil destined for a toxic landfill in their community. In 1987, under the leadership of Reverend Dr. Ben Chavis Jr., the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ published Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. This groundbreaking study found that race, not income, was the facilities across the United States. 3 out of 5 Black and Hispanic Americans, the report revealed, lived in communities near an uncontrolled toxic waste site. Environmental racism, Dr. Chavis proclaimed, is an issue of life and death. It's not just some form of prejudice where someone doesn't like you because of the color of your skin. This is an issue that will take your life away if you don't get involved. By the 21st century, grassroots groups across the country like Sustainable South Bronx, Philly Thrive, Louisiana's Bridge the Gulf, and Chicago's Little Village Environmental Justice Organization were giving voice to pollution's first victims and lifting up the linkages between inequality and the ecological crisis. Then came COVID-19 and the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. In the devastation it inflicts upon low-income people and communities of color, the pandemic looks a lot like the climate crisis, compressed from decades into weeks. And the repeated killings of unarmed Black people, often horrifically recorded on video, have finally brought home to whites what Americans of color have always known: that our society is deeply infected by racism, both structural and personal. More and more people are seeing the fatal interconnections of white supremacy, pandemic, and pollution. Climate change, intensive agriculture, habitat destruction, and live markets have all distorted our relations with other species, unleashing viruses that jump from animals to humans. Born of colonialism and conquest, our throwaway society throws away people too. Long before COVID-19, people of color, forced by poverty and housing discrimination into neighborhoods near highways, fossil fuel power plants, and other sources of air pollution, have suffered disproportionately from respiratory illness, which makes them more vulnerable to the coronavirus. They live in more crowded housing. They disproportionately hold jobs deemed essential even while underpaid, such as in sanitation, food services, and healthcare. They can't afford to stay safe by staying home. And to get to work, many rely on public transportation, despite the risk of infection. And once infected, people of color die at higher rates because they lack equal access to health care. Climate change, explains Black essayist Mary Anais Hegler, takes any problem you already had, any threat you were already under, and multiplies it. It's time to talk about climate, she says, as the Black issue it is. It's time to talk about how extreme heat begets extreme violence and how that can interact with an already extremely violent police force, she continues. It's time to talk about what happens in prisons, which often lack air conditioning as temperatures skyrocket. It's time to talk about what Hurricane Katrina revealed and what I can never, ever unsee. When disaster strikes, the power structure will either abandon us or turn even more sharply against us. When resources run low, we will have the least, and when we try to take what we need, we'll be labeled looters and shot on sight. It's time to talk about my biggest fear about the climate crisis, Hegler says. My biggest fear is not how will we treat each other. It's how will white people treat people who look like me. Last month, African-American marine biologist Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson issued a public appeal to white people who care about maintaining a habitable planet. I need you. I need you to become actively anti-racist. I need you to understand that our racial inequality crisis is intertwined with our climate crisis. If we don't work on both, we will succeed at neither. I need you to step up, please, because I am exhausted. Now is a time of reckoning and a time of opportunity. At the the intersection of racism and pandemic and climate crisis, where do we begin to confront the challenges that beset us? I think we begin by taking power seriously. A lot of white middle-class people like me seem to feel that change happens when reasonable arguments persuade reasonable decision makers to support reasonable policies. But the entwined histories of white supremacy, the environmental movement, and the pandemic all demonstrate that that reasonable assumption is an unreasonable fallacy. If there is no struggle, said Frederick Douglass in 1857, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand, Douglass said. It never did, and it never will. I was reading Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and I was brought up short by his definition of an activist. An activist, Dr. Kendi says simply, is one who has a record of power or policy change. Ruh-roh. He's saying that no matter how many times I telephone my legislator, no matter how many demonstrations I march in, no matter how many tweets I tweet, none of these makes me an activist. Changing minds is not activism, he says. An activist produces power and policy change, not mental change. If a person has no record of power and policy change, then that person is not an activist. Wow. By that exacting but reasonable standard, how many of us are even activists? I believe there are times to show up, speak the truth, and bear sacred witness, whether or not we prevail. Gandhi said, "Full effort is full victory." But I accept Dr. Kendi's challenge to take power seriously. The balance and paradox of commitment and surrender sustain me in the long struggle. 4 months ago, I became executive director of Massachusetts Interfaith Power and Light, one of the 38 state affiliates of the National Interfaith Power and Light movement. For 2 decades, IPL has helped congregations become better earth stewards, shrinking the carbon footprints of houses of worship across the country, and educating hundreds of thousands of people in the pews about the role people of faith can play in addressing climate change. But we know that greening our congregations, however important, does not adequately confront the climate crisis, nor does it address the systemic injustice that undergirds it. We've got to organize and advocate public policies to advance clean energy, reduce carbon pollution, and end decades of environmental racism and inequity. Your minister, Duffy Pete, has helped launch Montana Interfaith Power and Light, which this congregation has generously supported and hopefully will join as a member. You can find out more about their work at www.montanaipl.org. And that link will be in the chat window. Just over a month from now, on September 25th and 26th, Montana IPL will host the 2020 Faith, Science, and Climate Action Conference, Cultivating Soil, Soul, and Health. You can register for this interactive online event at www.fscaconference.org, and you'll find that link also in the chat window. But you don't have to wait a month. You don't have to wait a month to make your voice heard. At a time when utilities nationwide are abandoning coal combustion because it fuels global warming and pollutes neighborhoods, Montana's largest utility, Northwestern Energy, wants to double down on coal and boost its share of the Colstrip power plant, the largest single source of carbon pollution in the state. Northwestern wants to burn coal at Colstrip through 2042 and foist the risk of this purchase on Montana ratepayers. You can help stop them. The Public Service Commissioner for Bozeman, Roger Koopman, has already spoken out against pre-approval of Northwestern's proposal. That's a good thing. Call him tomorrow, thank him for his stance, and ask him to stay strong. As a member of the faith community, tell him that burning more coal in a climate crisis is immoral. His phone number is 406-444-6168, and you'll find that number in the chat window. If you get voicemail, leave a message. Trust me, you will feel better when you lift your voice for climate justice. Naima Penniman is a healer, grower, educator, and performance artist. She's also the daughter of a Unitarian Universalist minister, Adele Smith Penniman. I'd like to close with what Naima Penniman wrote in memory of George Floyd. May our grief bring us closer to the truth, to each other, to our collective suffering and significance, to our rebellious radiance. Invoke the bravery of our ancestors, evidence that survival is possible, because we are here. Feel the movement of air. Enter your nostrils. Feel your chest expand. Create more space around the heart. Open your throat. Fill your lungs. Become buoyant. Become quiet. Hear the steady pulse of your own drum. Become thunder. Become torrential rain. There's a knee on the neck of our precious reflection, lost to lack of breath. We need to breathe deeper. There's a virus multiplying at the speed of light, extinguishing our inhales. We need to breathe deeper. The lungs of the world are on fire, scorching the forests, whose life work is to balance the atmosphere of our singular, sacred earth. We need to breathe deeper. Our children have asthma. Our grandmas are gasping. We need to breathe deeper. The machine is crashing. The empire is collapsing. We need to breathe through the contractions of this excruciating passage. Labor pain feels like dying, pushing into a ring of fire. But someone is wanting to be born and worth fighting for. Our wombs full of seeds and stars. Our blood full of seers and warriors. The conch is signaling ceremony and insurrection. Become lightning striking its yes into the atmosphere. The winds are stirring, the undertow of unspoken stories, the currents of unflinching change. We dedicate our lives to a world conducive to life. We commit our breath to destiny, where all of us can breathe. Amen.